particularly little boys in the throes of grief as I was, mourning the sudden loss of the only mother I'd ever known, Kiki. But with bombs falling around our ears, this new mother had other things to deal with. And deal with them she did. All private motor vehicles had been mobilized by the Army for the transport of troops. But somehow, Lolek had managed to hold back a large company truck. With this truck painted Army green now, and a factory driver disguised as a soldier, my mother and I made our way out of Warsaw in the middle of the night on what was the second or the third night of the bombing. In the back of this box truck, along with my mother and me, were two of my aunts and their two children, and the governess of one of the children, a Miss Bronia. And fortunately for me, Miss Bronia, with a little gold cross on a chain around her neck, quickly picked up on my emotional issues and gave me special attention, while Mother and the aunts gossiped, squabbled over who would give orders to whom, and complained that our cook Marta, who Mother had instructed to pack sandwiches, hadn't had the intelligence to pack something to drink as well. If I needed any further explanation as to why the gates of heaven were closed to my relatives, I had my answer right there. And the idea of lying to our soldiers by disguising ourselves as an army truck was a Jewish trick that was tantamount to treason. Now, you've all heard about the German tactic of bombing the cities in order to get the inhabitants out onto the highways, making it impossible for the Polish army to move. Well, we were right in the middle of that refugee traffic. We were strafed, we had Stukas drop bombs on us, and we watched people die. I watched a middle-aged man helping his wife to walk in the warm September sun suddenly turn red, choke, and slowly sink down into the crowd. I saw a woman sitting up after a Messerschmitt had strafed us, holding up what I at first thought was a bloody glove. Then I realized that was her severed hand. And when a woman we had picked up on the road took us to her sister's house to spend the night, her sister didn't want to let us in because we were Jewish. Eventually we found our way to a farm in eastern Poland on an estate that belonged to some friends of my Aunt Paula, where we believed we could safely sit out the next week or two until the French and the British, with whom Poland had a mutual defense treaty, drove the Germans back into Germany. And again, it was the Catholic Miss Bronia who knew how to barter for food, kill chickens, make a fire, cook, and minister to my emotional needs, while my mother and aunties amused themselves with more gossip and hitching wagon rides into town to shop and pick up news of the war. One morning we discovered that eastern Poland, where we were, had suddenly been occupied by the Soviets. The mothers immediately began to restyle their dresses to look more like peasants, smear mud on their faces, and resew their jewelry into lining and buttons. Soon local peasants showed up at our cottage wearing red armbands and Russian helmets and declaring themselves the security committee. They demanded to know the names of all the members of our group and proceeded to write them down in the margins of scraps torn out of a newspaper. My mother tried to use her charm on the committee's leader in order to neutralize their hostility. Her message was misunderstood, resulting in some very embarrassing moments, followed by orders to vacate the cottage. As we rode the wagon piled with our belongings into the nearby town, Mother was my aunt's doghouse, and I was secretly glad that one of her Jewish tricks had backfired, even though we all had to pay by losing our cozy cottage. In town, conditions were very bad. A Russian soldier stood on every corner with a rifle slung over his shoulder, and megaphones were blaring communist propaganda, telling us what a paradise the Soviet Union was, while the stores were totally cleaned out. To buy bread or meat or vegetables, you first had to find a store that had some, then wait in line on the sidewalk, hoping that they still had it when you got inside. Firewood would be available on a haphazard basis. What we found for living quarters was a dank, moldy, two-room ground floor apartment without plumbing and heated by a cooking stove in one of the rooms. Our first night there, we took all the clothes out of our suitcases and laid them out on the floor for one large bed. Our supper that night was carrot soup. Later, Miss Bronya would show us how to sew pallets out of any material we could find and fill them with straw. Once a train full of firewood showed up at the train station, and you could take all you could carry. It was a rainy day, and we all tramped to the station to carry firewood home. But again, you had to wait in line for your turn, and Mother, instead of waiting in the rain, looked up the army officer in charge, spoke to him in Russian. My grandmother was Russian. Told him that I was very sick, and charmed him into detailing soldiers to carry wood home for us, while everyone else continued to wait their turn. I was mortified by Mother's underhanded, immoral, and certainly unchristian behavior. Mother had similar techniques for cutting down on time spent waiting in line at the butcher's or the baker's. Once she saw a man close to the head of the line who was dressed as though he might be an upper-class resident of one of the large cities. She walked up to him and began a conversation, as though they were old friends from Warsaw. He, realizing exactly what Mother was up to, responded, and they kept this up until it was his turn in the store, at which point he pulled Mother and me in with him, to loud cries of foul from all the shoppers. I was mortified once more. Each time one of these things happened, my sense of propriety, as cultivated by Kiki, was outraged, and my anti-Semitism increased. The fact that we're eating better and staying warmer than we might have otherwise did not enter into my thinking. And sometime later, when a neighbor's baby girl became ill and people stood around helplessly, it was Mother who went out into the street at night, alone, and somehow came back with a Russian army doctor. But none of this rated very highly on my 7-year-old's list of values. One day, Mother wrangled a ride to the nearby city of Lviv. It was an overnight trip, and in Lviv, Mother ran into many of her Warsaw friends. From them, she learned that in Lviv, one could hire a local mountaineer guide to guide you across the Carpathian Mountains, on foot into Hungary, if one was willing to risk being eaten by wolves, shot by the border guards, or captured, returned, and then shot by the political police. This immediately captured Mother's imagination. On her return to our apartment, Mother told our little family that now we were all going to escape, just as others had done. The fact that those others were young men, not women with children, and that their escape had been before the Carpathians were covered with snow, had little effect over Mother's enthusiasm. In fact, she considered it an advantage, since no one would be expecting 4 women with children to be trying to escape. My aunts, of course, told her she was crazy and would have none of it. But a few days later, Mother and I found ourselves in Le Pension in Lviv. The mountaineers who hired themselves out as guides for these adventures weren't interested in crossing the Carpathians with a woman and child. But then one day, Mother did find one guide who, for twice the going rate, would take us across the Carpathians, carrying me on his back. It was the middle of February now, and dressed as peasants, and having paid the guide in advance, my mother and I traveled by train to a village near the border from which we would be making our escape the following day. Sewn into the lining and buttons of our clothes were the diamonds pried out of Mother's rings and brooches. To spend the night, it had been arranged that Mother and I would sleep in the cottage of an elderly rabbi, who, along with his wife, had sheltered other hopeful escapees. I knew what a rabbi was. He was a Jewish priest, and I expected him to come to the door in a cassock with a Star of David on a chain around his neck. But what I found instead was a very old and frail man sitting in a chair by the stove, in a fur hat and gloves with the fingertips cut off, reading, smoking, and coughing, and who, by my estimate, was only minutes from boarding that sweaty streetcar in the sky. For some reason, my own celestial issues moved to the back of my mind as I felt very sad and very, very sorry for him.